All right, looking at, there's a series of lessons in our book called, just generally titled, The Organization of the Church, and this one is on the matter of special relationships, and it begins a series of examinations with reference to, just cutting straight to the chase, Ephesians chapter 4, and beginning in about verse 7 or 8, where Paul speaks to the Ephesian brethren with regard to, he gave some to be apostles and some prophets, some pastors, evangelists, some pastors and teachers. And then you have also the list in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, where a similar list is found, and yet there is the notation that the lists should not be considered as parallel because they are given to different people at different times to address different problems or different issues. Not necessarily a problem in Ephesus, but certainly a problem in Corinth. When the list is provided in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, it is the introduction of a very lengthy discourse on spiritual gifts. And so there's the expanded list of gifts in 1 Corinthians 12, but it's given to correct a lot of the misunderstandings and problems at Corinth, while the list that is provided to the Ephesian church is significantly shorter and also is not given to correct problems, but just simply to give instruction to the church in matters particularly of unity that you see there. You get down to verses 13, 14, 15, and 16 in Ephesians chapter 4. Paul says it's for the edifying of the body of Christ, the unity of the faith, until the final revealed word is come to the church. And so he's going to examine these particular relationships in order from Ephesians chapter 4, obviously then beginning with the apostles and the relationship of the apostles to the early church. I found this lesson to be particularly enlightening and intriguing. And I think it's going to be very helpful to us when we think about it, especially in view as we make our way through the list and in the way that we generally think about the local church and the eldership. And I think that this lesson is going to be helpful to give us an accurate picture of the work of the apostles, especially going back even to the earliest days of the church. And I think there are some misconceptions that we probably have about the apostleship or the apostles, and he works diligently and I think very accurately and thoroughly in dispelling some of the ideas I think that lurk in our minds with regard to the work of the apostles in the early church. Now over to page 99, and in the first full paragraph there, beginning with the words, "What place?" Listen to these series of questions, because this is going to set the stage for the rest of this material. It says, "What place was occupied by the apostles as a body of men in the organization of the church? What ecclesiastical powers did they have? And by what authority did they exercise them?" That's three very good questions, and certainly worthy of our consideration. By the way, the idea of what ecclesiastical powers did they have simply refers to their authority over the church, and also with regard to, I believe that he's using the term ecclesiastical in the terms of was there a hierarchy? Was there a hierarchy? And as we go through the lesson, I think you'll see why I believe that's the direction he's going. In other words, was there a church hierarchy in the earliest days following the establishment of the church? And the answer, and I know this sounds inconsistent, but the answer is yes and no. It's yes and no. Because there is a definite list, there is an order that Paul gives. For example, in Ephesians 4, he says, first, apostles. So there you find there's an order, and then you have the establishment of the church, the foundation of the church. We'll mention in just a few minutes, back in Ephesians chapter 2, with the apostles and the prophets and Jesus being the chief cornerstone. Well, that indicates somewhat of a hierarchy. In other words, an order, and yet the answer, I think, can also be said as no, in the sense, in the way that those powers, I don't know if that's the right word or not, I guess power is the only way, or authority was exercised. Okay, and so looking at these three questions. Now, toward the bottom of page 99, actually just past halfway in that paragraph, you see the phrase "to anyone." Okay, you see there it says, "To anyone, however, who will read the New Testament record carefully. Anything that resembles ecclesiastical power among the apostles and anything that resembles lordship is exceedingly difficult to find." In other words, when you read, we've had this idea in our minds about the apostles in the New Testament. And yet a careful reading of the text will not support the idea that the apostles formed some type of 12-man council or board of directors that oversaw the life and work of the church. And I think that's probably how we viewed the apostles in large part through the years. That there's the apostles, and they're the 12-man board of directors, and everything that the church was taught came down through this board of directors, and they were like Harry Truman. They had a little placard on their board of directors table that said, "The buck stops here." And yet that's not the picture that the New Testament paints of the apostles as we particularly read through the book of Acts. And this goes on, it says, the power that these men had was to qualify them to render a service which was briefly described as, "You shall be my witnesses." You shall be my witnesses. And then note, in the bottom, keep going, it's going to go over to page 100. In all the New Testament record, there are only 3 references made to the authority of an apostle. 2 are made by Paul in the 2 Corinthian letter, and in each case, the reference, that is, the reference to the apostolic authority, is followed immediately by the words, "which the Lord gave for building you up and not for casting you down." So in those 2 instances where Paul mentioned his authority as an apostle, he said what was given to him was given expressly for the building up of the church. Not the micromanagement of the church, not to hand down edicts to the church, but rather for the building up of the church. And you think, now how is that done? How is that building up done? And I think it would be safe to say that just about in every case, the building up comes from having a very personal relationship with the brethren. A very personal relationship with the brethren. And think about it, does a board of directors have a personal relationship with the employees of a company? Do they have a personal relationship with the thousands of shareholders that have invested? No. I mean, they're just kind of up here at the top of of the skyscraper, making their decisions and handing those things down. Whereas Paul repeatedly spoke of his work as an apostle, as a servant. I've made myself a servant to all. And yet Paul was an apostle. And he says, my authority is for building you up and not for tearing you down. And then the third is the statement that is made in the Thessalonians. It says, we might have claimed authority or been burdensome as apostles of Christ. Now, in that context, Paul is talking about the fact that he did not exercise his right as an apostle to be financially supported by the brethren. 1 Thessalonians 2 says, we worked with our hands and provided for our own needs. And by the way, Paul said that more than once in his writings, and it is given to us even as an example in the book of Acts. That Paul, the phrase, if you've ever heard the phrase, tent-making preacher. In the Brotherhood, we refer to tent-making preachers, and I guess maybe other religions do, or religious groups do as well. But what it means is it's a preacher who has a job somewhere else to support himself, and he preaches, but his preaching is not his primary source of support. And repeatedly through his work, Paul was because he was a literal tent maker. That's where the phrase came from, Acts 18. He was a tent maker. And repeatedly, Paul, everywhere Paul went, whether he was in Corinth or whether he was in Thessalonica, wherever it was, he worked to support himself, and the brethren didn't support him financially. He rebuked the church at Corinth for such. But the point was, Paul had the authority and the right, not just as an apostle, but as a gospel preacher, to be supported financially by the people that he taught. But he did not exercise that authority. He talked about himself and Barnabas as having the authority or the right to lead about a Christian life in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Are we the only ones that are we the only ones that have to work for a living? The rest of the apostles don't work. In other words, you have this view of us that we ought to work to support ourselves, and yet you know that Peter doesn't work to support himself, and the other apostles don't work to support themselves and their families, and we don't even have families. It'd be easier to support us than it would those guys, because we don't have families to take care of, and yet you're not supporting us, but we have the right to receive it, not only as apostles, but also as ministers. And so Paul spoke and instructed regarding his authority as an apostle, but he might say he was willing to forego that authority in order that the church might be built up and not torn down. And so it shows us that the work of the apostles was not from the top down, but was at ground level with the brethren. In other words, they understood, they knew the brethren, they understood the brethren because they walked among the brethren. Think about this. I just saw this in the newspaper or somewhere this week. There's something going on in the state of Alabama in the education system right now where, and I haven't researched it enough to know a whole lot about it, but apparently that there's some bill coming through Montgomery that if it goes through, they're going to end up failing a bunch of third graders. Because they're going to pass some bill that requires some degree of proficiency in reading or something, and if you don't pass the proficiency test, you don't go to the fourth grade. All right? So what kind of problems might that cause?
Why did they just pick third grade?
Well, and that's a good question as well. That's what I said, Kathy. I don't know all the details of why it came here. Why it was at this point, but the point is, you've got a bunch of people who don't know a whole lot about education, who are presuming to make laws, which I understand. It's their responsibility to make laws. But the point is that when people who don't understand are put in charge of making rules for others, oftentimes they make really, really bad decisions. All right. Like I said, I don't know. And by the way, I'm not against proficiency. You know, if you're in the 3rd grade, you ought to be able to read. All right, because we got some way yonder beyond the 3rd grade that can't read. You know, but they're
or pass the civics test.
Yeah. To graduate, pass the civics test. Understand that there's 3 branches of government and which ones they are. But enough about AOC this morning. But the point that I'm making is that the apostles were not up here handing down things to people that they didn't know or understand. They worked among the people day after day after day. And Stroop makes the point of this, and I'm just going to kind of go ahead and jump ahead of, because it's going to be later in the lesson. But when there became a problem in the church, in the earliest days of the church, in Acts chapter 6, with the administration of the benevolence to the widows, it says there was a murmuring among the people because the Grecian widows were being neglected in the daily administration. So what did the apostles do? Did they just hand down some arbitrary rule to solve? All right, well, we got a problem now. We're just going to make a rule and we're going to solve this problem. Here's the rule. No, it's not what they did at all. They said, you choose out from among yourselves 7 men whom we may appoint over this business. So when the problem arose in the church, who got to solve it? Who solved it? They did. The church did. The church solved their own problem. Now the apostles gave the plan. Find you some guys that are good, solid men that are faithful, and you appoint them. You select them. We'll appoint them over this business. And you know what the Bible says? And the saying pleased the whole multitude. And they picked those 7 men, and the apostles appointed them. But the point is, the apostles were among the brethren, and they didn't just hand down answers to every problem that arose in the church. Now we can even go a step further. Open your Bibles to. I think it's Acts 12. This is not in the book, but I think it's in Acts 12. I was going to go to Acts 15, but I want to start in Acts 12. In Acts, it's not 12, it's 11, but it's at the end of 11. In Acts 11, 27 to 30, you have the dearth of the famine that's about to arise in Judea. Agabus the prophet tells the brethren what's going on here in Antioch, and says there's going to be a problem with the brethren in Judea feeding themselves. It says, then the disciples, verse 29, each according to his ability, determined to send relief to the brethren dwelling in Judea. This they also did, and sent it where?
The elders.
To the elders. Sent it to the elders. Now, where were the apostles? Where were the apostles? They were in Jerusalem, right? Where's this money going? It's going to Jerusalem, right? So why didn't it say they sent the money to the apostles? If the apostles are in charge, You know, if they're the ruling authority in the church over Jerusalem, why was the money sent to the elders?
Well, that was the organization of the church. They had set up, the apostles had set up elders. When they started the church, they went back and had ordained elders, never where they'd been. And then that's the one that was in charge at that time.
Right. In other words, the apostles had put the plan for the church in place, and even though they were still living, they were all still living in Jerusalem, by the way. Acts 8, after the persecution arose, says they were scattered abroad. They all were scattered abroad except for the apostles. They were not scattered in the persecution. So here's Acts 12, and the organization of the church is in place, and the apostles are still, they're still apostles. They're still in Jerusalem, but they're allowing the church to function.
Rule over themselves.
That's right. They're allowing the church to handle its own business in the way that God intended for it from the beginning. Now let's go to Acts 15. Now let's go to Acts 15. Sir?
I said that's an early proof of autonomy right there.
That's right. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah. That's the autonomy of the church is right there. That's exactly right. Now, in Acts 15, look in verse 1. And certain men came down from Judea and taught the brethren, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. Therefore, when Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and dispute with them, they determined that Paul and Barnabas and certain others of them should go up to Jerusalem. To who? The apostles and elders. Now, this situation is different than the situation in Acts 11. The situation in Acts 11 was a matter of benevolence. In other words, there was no need for any type of divine provision for that matter to be handled. But what do we have here in this situation? There you go, the matter of doctrine. The matter where the apostles were uniquely qualified to speak and to step in when necessary. But it also, but again, it says the apostles and the elders. The apostles and the elders. Now you get down to verse 4. Paul and Barnabas and those men are sent. It said when they would come to Jerusalem, they were received by the church and the apostles. What? And the elders. And the elders. No, elders are included right along there, alongside the apostles. Look at verse 6. Now the apostles and the elders came together to do what? To consider this matter. All of them are brought here together to consider the matter. Moving on through to verse number 22. Verse 22. Then it pleased the apostles and the elders and the whole church to send chosen men of their own company to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas, namely Judas, who was surnamed Barsabbas, and Silas, leading men among the brethren. Again, look at the relationship that is involved here. The apostles, the elders, and the what? The whole church. The whole church. That gives us, again, a very clear picture of the work of the apostles as being among the brethren. But it also gives us a clear picture of the elders being among the brethren, right? And so, going all the way back to the beginning of the class, and Stroop's going to address this a little later on in this lesson and the next, because he's going to move on into the matter of the elders. If we have a misunderstanding of the work of the apostles in the early church, that they were just like I said, a board of directors handing down dictates to the rest of the company, then what view might we get of the elders in the local church? That they do the same thing, right? I mean, would it be fair, and I'm not saying here, I'm just saying in general, would it be fair to say that many brethren view the elders solely as a decision-making body? I mean, we understand the elders don't get to make doctrine, right? We all understand that. But could it not be the case that we viewed the eldership as being nothing more than a decision-making body? Let me ask you this. Is it possible that elderships have viewed themselves as decision-making bodies?
Yes, they
Yeah. You see that in churches that have problems.
Yeah,
You know that.
right.
When the church, when part, especially if there's a split or people leave, you know, that some have made decisions that everybody didn't agree with or thought was wrong.
Mm-hmm. And so, and I don't know, did y'all hear what John said? Talking about when a lot of times if you have a division, you'll have, like, people will leave a church in a large group, that many times it's because the elders have made a decision, perhaps that they don't agree with. Now that can be an indication of one of, there's a number of problems that might be manifest in that. Number one, it may be the case that the people don't respect the eldership.
That is very possible.
Especially in our day and time, in our anti-authoritarian society. There are people that will not respect the eldership. All right? But on the other hand, you could have the case that the eldership views themselves as an authoritarian body of decision makers, and we're going to hand this thing down to you, you know, and you're going to do it whether you like it or not. Right?
Right, so truth, let's be grown-ups, truth is truth. It'll always come out. If the group as a whole were taught correctly and everything was working right, there wouldn't be that big of a decision or division between people. And we know from time past we've seen good people leave a group
Mm-hmm.
and go somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Now, let me ask one more question in this line of thinking. If an eldership were truly functioning as God intended for that eldership to function, which is among the people, right? Among the people. Not as lords over, as Peter said, not as being lords over, or, rulers over the Lord's inheritance. In other words, the church belongs to the Lord. It doesn't belong to the eldership. If you have a group of elders that are truly functioning in the way that the Bible pictures the elders were to function, which is, again, pictured for the elders in the apostles, what would be the likelihood of mass exoduses when decisions are made that people don't agree with? In other words, would people be more inclined to forbear in a situation where something goes on that they don't agree with if they understand that the elders are among them and have their best interest at heart? You see how all that can work together? I mean, look. I mean, yeah, I'm pretty sure. All right, I'm pretty sure that in 32 years of marriage, Rhonda hasn't agreed with every decision I've made. I'm fairly certain. I could be wrong on that. You can ask her.
I wonder sometimes.
If you're trained or right, should agree with you.
What's that?
If you're trained or right, should agree with you.
That's right. But just because I make a decision for the household that maybe she doesn't agree with doesn't mean that she's going to bail, right? You don't get to bail. Why? Well, because hopefully you have a track record that says, even if you don't agree with my decision, you understand that it's made in hopes that it brings the best good to the household, right? All right. So the same thing would go with the eldership and the local church.
Well, this verse 22, if I'm understanding it right, says the apostles and elders with the whole church. So you can't sit up on your throne like an elder, sit up and be the big boss. You got to include, you got to bring it down within the people within the church.
Mm-hmm.
Which I know the last decision will be up to the eldership about, but
Right.
you can bring it to the people and see, what they think about it.
Right. And there are, and depending on the size and the makeup of a congregation, those matters can be handled and have to be handled differently at different times. In other words, sometimes a decision can be made that allows for the input of all the members. Right? But depending again on the size and the makeup of the congregation, sometimes it's not best. It's not best to have everybody's input. Which is why the church doesn't exist with men's business meetings. Because that's not the way it's, and you certainly it doesn't exist with congregational business meetings. And I'll just give you an example, all right? Because I know you're wondering, well, what might go on that where everybody doesn't get to have their say or have some input? The church where Shelby attends at Walnut Street in Dixon, Tennessee. What got Shelby? 800 members? At least? There's 800 members. Right? And Steve was the preacher there for a long time. And he wanted to take a different role with the congregation. All right? He wanted to step out of the pulpit and work more closely with the individual families in the congregation. So then, and the elders were agreeable to that. So now what do they have to do? What's the next job? What's the task for the elders? Got to find a preacher. Now, with 800 people, are you going to parade 5 or 6 different guys Sunday after Sunday in front of 800 people and ask them which one that they like the best? What are you going to get? You're going to get a whole bunch of different answers, right? I mean, you might have 200 that like this guy the best, and 300 like this guy the best, and 100 like this guy the best, and you end up with zero consensus. So you know what the elders did at Walnut Street? They found a really good preacher that had preached a number of times in that congregation, held gospel meetings for them, been on their summer series over and over again. He was just right down the road in Centerville. It's a guy I've known for over 25 years, Brian McAllister. He used to preach in Jackson, Missouri. And he's been in Centerville, Tennessee for a while. The elders went and said, Brian, would you be interested in being the preacher here? Steve wants to step down, work more closely with the brethren. We need a pulpit guy. We know you. We love you. We trust you. We think you're our guy. Would you consider coming? And he did. And one Sunday, the elders got up and said, Steve is stepping down, and Brian McAllister is going to be our next preacher. They didn't go consult with 800 people over that matter. What did they do? They used their collective wisdom and their knowledge that the church already knew Brian and loved Brian, and then they brought in Brian. And so there are some situations that are naturally not agreeable to taking a poll of the congregation. Now look, I understand, like, if you're going to hire a preacher like at Burleson, you're going to have to do something like that. I know that's the way it went when I came in '96. I came and I tried out, and the elders, talked to me, and they said, we think you're our guy. I was talking to Wade. Wade said, we think you're our guy. We want you to come here, but we're going to talk to the congregation first on Wednesday night. On Wednesday night, January the 31st, they had a meeting of the brethren, and they, I guess, a show of hands, or I don't know, I wasn't here. But in that case, in our case, you do need to do something like that. But again, it still goes to the relationship that the elders have with the local church. Those brethren at Walnut Street trust their elders. And they believe that whatever decision is made is always, I wouldn't be so foolish to think that all 800 people think Brian McAllister is the greatest preacher, but he is really, really good. He's really, really good. But no one preacher is going to please everybody. But the relationship that the elders had, with the brethren allowed them to make that decision for the church, and she went off without a hitch. And so it shows you that, and again, going all the way back to the beginning, I know we're about to get our next bell. The apostles were among the brethren. They were among the brethren. They knew the needs of the brethren. They were sensitive to the needs of the brethren. And when it was possible, they let the church handle the problem. When the matter of Acts 15 rolls around, you've got a doctrinal issue. And nobody was better suited. Nobody was better suited than the apostles to handle that matter. But the elders were also included in those discussions and deliberations. And so I think the apostles paint a great picture for us in what we might refer to as servant leadership, which I think paves the way for the eldership, which I think is also servant leadership. But I'm going to put this in your head. Do not misunderstand servant leadership as being absolutely without authority. Because back about 25 years ago, there was this, and probably longer ago than that, there was this insidious doctrine that was being taught among the churches of Christ that elders don't have any authority in the local church beyond their example. Only their example. And we had to fight that for a long time. Elderships do have authority by example, but not only by example. And that's where we'll pick up, Lord willing, next time.